I didn't see you there. It's just making a little bit of bread over here. And I was just thinking about the Cold War and decolonization, which were hallmarks of the post-World War II period. What? You were thinking about the same thing? That's incredible. Why don't you pull up a chair and let's talk about it. So at the end of the Second World War, the big three from that war, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, were showing some signs of tension. Personal mistrust and misunderstanding started to lay the foundation for a long and protracted Cold War. With the decline of Europe, much of the world started to divide, or was being divided along hostile ideological lines, aligned with the two new emerging superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And the two superpowers sort of spent a lot of time jockeying for influence. Over the nearly half-century-long Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union never went directly to war with each other, which is why we call it a Cold War instead of a hot war. Nevertheless, an estimated 50 million people died, half of those people civilian, in dozens of proxy wars and other conflicts fought on behalf of this ideological conflict. You might be wondering why I am in this cold freezer right now, and it's just because I need to get something to go with the dinner tonight. So much of it began after the Big Three in World War II, when Joseph Stalin made it clear that he intended to take those parts of Eastern Europe that that Russia had liberated from the Nazis and make it part of a Soviet sphere of influence. Oh, let me show you. This is perfect. Okay, so you can see here in Eastern Europe, the eastern part of Europe would have been like communists, and then also here on the Korean Peninsula, the same idea here. 3.
Stop, Dad. That wasn't nice.
So the United States and its allies became increasingly concerned that this was a sign of the spread of communism to all around the globe. And from that point, both sides of the conflict began to make a number of decisions that would drive up the costs, the myriad costs of the Cold War. One of those concepts was this idea of containment, where the United States and its allies were concerned about this spread of communism, and like the domino theory, this fear that, like dominoes, the states of the world would fall to communism. Whoops. Containment meant that the U.S. and its allies would often support or encourage resistance to Soviet spread in those countries that surrounded Soviets. This rivalry, of course, was often fought by others or with others in these proxy wars, which is similar to the kinds of things we talked about during imperialism between Britain and France. Examples include the Korean War, fought 1950 to 1953, which ended in a stalemate that still exists today. The Cuban Revolution, the Vietnam War, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua in 1979. Another product of the Cold War was the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, as it's known, which is an alliance and a pledge of troops between the United States, Canada, and 9 European countries to protect against the threat of a potential Soviet invasion in Europe. In response, the Eastern European nations, along with the Soviet Union, created their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact nations. But perhaps the most dangerous and costly product of the Cold War was the nuclear arms race. So in 1949, soon after World War II, the Soviet Union got the bomb. And this led to a nuclear arms race where the two nations built enormous arsenals of global destruction. And those destructive arsenals also destroyed their country's budgets. It got so bad that a former U.S. general who led U.S. forces in Europe during World War II, Dwight Eisenhower, who was at the time president, worried to the nation at the end of his presidency in 1960 that the military-industrial complex was consuming the American economy. So in the 1970s and 80s, the Cold War began to thaw. And in the late 80s, beginning in 1989, many of the nations in the Warsaw Pact, communist nation, dictatorial nations in Eastern Europe began to fall. And the Soviet Union itself in 1991, which brought an end technically to the Cold War and left the United States in many ways the only superpower left. But many of the ramifications of that time are still felt today, especially if we just think about the idea of the nuclear arsenal that the United States, the Soviet Union, and many of the former Soviet republics have possession of. And many nations around the world have spent time developing or have developed weapons of mass destruction that threaten the stability and safety of people on the planet. Oh, hi! I needed to work the dough for the second rise, and I thought it would be a perfect time to talk about decolonization. Between the 1940s and the 1970s, you can bring that over, dozens of new countries formed, having obtained their independence from their imperial controllers in Europe. Many of those countries, good job, Maggie. Okay. Many of those countries attained their freedom and had to fight for it. Others were given freedom without fighting. You pull that into 3 pieces. Try and get 3 equal balls. One of the reasons this is an important subject is that the legacy of the second phase of imperialism is still very present today in many of those countries around the world. The permanent scars of European dominance. So I want to talk about a few of those factors and what those look like. So the first thing is that a lot of those countries, due to imperialism and often, frankly, racism, were left with a lack of educated professionals to manage their newfound freedoms, which often put them behind in the world. Number 2, often the imperializing nations took over regions or drew political lines in places with no regard for ethnic, cultural, religious identities of the people within those boundaries. And so during the period of domination, many imperializing Europeans used what they discovered as tensions, some occasionally, to sow animosity or hatred between groups as a tool of control. And those things obviously left a pretty major legacy of violence for those newly independent nations. Some examples are like the Darfurians in Sudan, the genocide of Rwanda. Well, number 3, many nations suffered economic collapse after decolonization due to the fact that their resources had been pillaged and depleted after years of colonial rule. And often new nations had corrupt governments and extreme gaps between rich and poor. So the fourth and final struggle that many of these new nations faced was that they entered the world in the midst of Cold War strife. And that often meant that they were pressured into allegiance with one side or the other in a way that was maybe not in their best interest and taken advantage of by the superpowers. Sometimes even to the extent of putting in puppet governments, unpopular governments that didn't really represent the needs of the people in order to prove their allegiance. So that brings us to present day as far as the history goes. There's a couple more topics I want to explore with you over the next couple of weeks that we can do, but unfortunately there's a lot of stuff I skimmed over or didn't cover, and that's the nature of being limited in time and scope. But I think we got some of the main points so that we can move on from here. Thanks for joining me today. I made some bread. Have a good day.